Hello and welcome to this edition of Tips and Tricks. Now today I'm going to be talking about how to fish behind a pro as a co-angler. Yeah, these guys, the big boys. Now I've been doing the FLWs as a co-angler for 10 years. And well, before I got into fishing them, I did a lot of research. I read about every tournament, you know, the tour, the pro tour, the FLW, the Bassmaster, all of them. I always read them, and I always saw, you know, what the pros were using. And a lot of times it was active baits, like crankbait, spinnerbait, or a frog, or topwater, or something. But then I always read and watched what the co-anglers used to catch their fish. And it was usually nothing to do with any sort of active bait. And I'm like, okay, well, how come these guys are out of here? And you're seeing these pros in this tournament, and they're catching them on active baits. And you're in the boat with them, and you're just behind them, but you're like, oh yeah. You would think, okay, if they're on that active bite and they're catching that big a fish, you should be throwing something like that. Well, that's the mistake most co-anglers make, me included. I have a hard time not trying to mimic what my pro is throwing in the front of the boat. And well, if you look at the results, usually a co-angler will win with pretty much half the weight that it takes for the pro to win a tournament. So yeah, so if a pro wins with a 3-day tournament, they win with 60 pounds. The co-angler might win with 30 pounds. And so, you know, before I started doing these things and started actually realizing what it's actually like to be in the back of the boat with a pro that's on a certain type of technique, and a lot of times an active, I mean, not always, but usually, or whatever. Once you get there, you start to realize why most of the co-anglers that consistently cash a check and consistently get in the top 10 and even consistently, you know, win are the ones that are using high percentage baits in high percentage places. Like I said, I've done this. I was there. I started out that way and I did all the research. And you're like, okay, well, they're using these sort of baits and they're catching twice the weight, bigger fish. So to me, I'm like, okay, well, you're going into it as a co-angler. Why would you not want to fish those sort of baits? Because you know those baits are catching a better quality fish. But when you get in the back seat, it's pretty much, I mean, these pros are there. They've done the pre-fishing. They've done the practicing. And to fish a lot of those active baits and everything, it's boat position and boat angle. And they're in the front of the boat. So they're getting all the best angles and everything else. And so if you're a co-angler, the way I was when I first went into it, I'm trying to mimic them. I'm trying to cast the same sort of bait or something behind them, but they've already caught a fish there or caught the active fish that was there and everything else. And so you're like, oh, but all I need, you know, yeah, sometimes you can catch 2 in the same area and all that, and you're trying. But you're just hanging out, you know, they're in the front of the boat and you're just hanging out in the back. It's just swinging around. Their position is obviously the best for the technique they're using. So that's why it's very, very favorable for a co-angler behind a pro to fish high percentage baits in high percentage places. And high percentage baits, there's something like a little worm on a drop shot, maybe just dragging a jig or Texas rig creature bait or something like that, or a stick worm. These are all extremely high percentage baits. Because you got to remember, like I said earlier, co-anglers win usually with half the weight. So when you're out there and if you're trying to mimic them and get the bigger weight, that's not really what it's about. Usually as a co-angler, it's about just getting 5 fish each day. Like I said, I've been doing it for 10 years now as a co-angler. The only tournament that I cashed a check, and it was the top 20, I think it was 19th or 18th, was the only tournament I actually caught 5 fish each day. I've caught 5 fish on one day and then like 3 fish the next day, or 3 fish first day and 4 fish the next day. But as a co-angler, fishing behind these pros that are in the front of the boat and getting all the angles and everything, it's about going down to fishing high percentage baits. You're not looking to match their weights. You're not looking, I mean, they're catching 3 and 4 pounders. As a co-angler, I mean, catching 2 and 3 pounders or 1 and 2 pounders can cash you a check and could win you the tournament. But it's really hard if you're out there and you're behind them and you're watching them catch a bigger quality fish on some sort of active bait or some sort of, bait that you're trying to mimic behind them, because you're seeing them catch them. You're like, oh, they got to miss one here and there. But no, they're a pro. They're there. They've been there for they've spent all the time and all the money to enter that as the person in the front of the boat, because they've found a pattern and everything else. And so for you as a co-angler, and the same mistake I made, like, oh, well, I know how to fish all those baits. I can't wait to get behind them and start whacking them behind them and that. But trust me, it's futile to really fish behind a pro. And I said I've gotten my ass kicked by hundreds of co-anglers. And majority of them are just going behind their pro, even if they're on an active bite or whatever. I mean, every once in a while there is a rare thing, like if they're on schooling fish or something out in the middle of that mimicking what they do will help you catch a limit. But I'm telling you, 95% of the time, you're better off just throwing little high percentage. I mean, you're only looking for half their weight. And you can throw this stuff and catch, 2 and 3 pounders. You might get lucky and, get like a 5 or a 6 or something. But that's what you need to do as a co-angler. I said I did all the study. I've been doing it for 10 years. I've read all the articles. I studied what the pros use. I studied what the co-anglers. And when I went into it, that's what I'm like, why are all these co-anglers just using like drop shots and Senkos and dragging jigs or dragging like a creature bait, when the winning pattern for the tournament was a buzzbait or a frog or or a squarebill crankbait or a bladed jig? But that's kind of what you have to realize as a co-angler is you're looking for half the weight, and they might be around a lot of those fish. They could win you the tournament, but they're not targeting those fish. They're targeting the fish that are like maybe a pound or 2 bigger than the average fish that they're around. And the average fish they're around, they can usually catch, no problem, with high percentage baits in high percentage places. But they're competing against the person in the front of the boat. You're competing against the person in the back of the boat. So that's why I wanted to come on here and tell you guys, because I get a lot of my viewers and a lot of people saying, hey, I need to try those. I want to try some of the co-angler stuff. Well, suck up your pride and just go with what works. High percentage baits. Just throw it around behind them. Just diddle around. Just drag it. Just keep your bait wet with something that's high percentage. And you might find yourself cashing checks or making a top 10. I mean, I know it's hard to do because you jump in and you see what they're doing, and I said I suffered from the same thing. I'm like, okay, I see what they're doing, and my pro's throwing this, my pro's throwing that. I'm going to throw the same thing behind him and around him. And, I end up in the 50th place and 60th place. And my friends that are very consistent co-anglers, like Dante and some of the ones that were just in my tournament diary, they're, in the top 10 and everything else, and they're just freaking throwing a Senko or throwing a drop shot or dragging a jig. So that's kind of the purpose of this little tips and tricks. I said I've been there. I've gotten my butt kicked tons of times because I just wouldn't, hard-headed. I wouldn't sit down and just use high percentage baits and just look for a quality keeper behind them, and I would end up, maybe mimicking them and getting one or two good quality fish, and then that was it. Where friends of mine and other co-anglers could get 5 fish that weren't really that big a fish, but they ended up, getting 3 more pounds each day than me, and then they end up getting a check, and I'm like, oh, but I caught bigger fish. I only caught 2, but it was 5 pounds. You caught 5, and it was only 9 pounds. So if I would have had 5 at that, I would have had like 13, and I would have done way. But that doesn't matter at the end of the day. It matters is I caught 2 good ones. They caught 5 okay ones. They catch a check, and I'm going home with nothing. So I said, just want to let you guys know. I know a lot of my people said they want to try this and get into this sort of co-angling, and so that's my tip for you. All right, that's gonna do it for this tips and tricks, and I hope it helped.